And we are pleased to have Dr. Cassie Yackley here with us today. Many of you know Dr. Yackley, have worked with her in the past, but for those of you who haven't, she's devoted more than 25 years of training and research in the effective treatment of trauma in families. Dr. Yackley has trained many child-serving systems in trauma-informed care, including Children's Mental Health Centers, DCYF, the Department of Education, Manchester Police Department, New Hampshire Hospital, just to name a few. She currently leads the Child Parent Psychotherapy Learning Community and consults regularly with those providers. Dr. Yackley is deeply embedded in the early childhood service system, including being an expert consultant for the New Hampshire Association for Infant Mental Health Credentialing Program. She's the co-developer of the Trauma-Informed Early Childhood Services Project, as well as a national trainer in the Child Parent Psychotherapy Program. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Cassie.
Hi there, everyone. I'm really glad to be talking with you today. We just received a message that there seems to be some feedback, so I just want to check in and find out if that's still an issue. Go ahead and let us know via chat if it's still echoing for you all. We want to make sure it's clear. So my understanding about the series, I'm really excited to be talking with you all, and pleased that people gave their feedback about what in particular would be useful to everyone. So this will be the first of the 3 webinars, and this one is focused primarily, again, on really understanding the science behind relationships, or what they're terming interpersonal neurobiology. And how we'll tackle that today is I first want to talk a bit about what is attachment, and then what are the attunement mechanisms that really drive attachment processes. And then we'll want to look at, as we move forward, what do we know about how these experiences end up being part of the person's enduring personality patterns, and in particular, habits in interpersonal relationships, and habits in terms of beliefs and thoughts and hopes. And then last, we want to look at how these past relationships then influence interpersonal functioning, and I think most importantly to the work that you all do, taking a look at what do these past relationship experiences mean for a person's capacity to provide caregiving. And then as we follow up with our other discussions, we certainly will talk about what do you do with that information when there are adverse experiences or traumatic experiences, but that isn't our focus today per se. Just checking in, any other sound issues we're hearing? Okay, so let's begin with our first section, and what we're trying to do here is really describe the neurobiological mechanisms by which attunement and attachment processes are supported and developed. So beginning with attachment, it's something we've certainly talked about in research for a very long time, and I think the brain sciences have caught up at this point in time, so I really want to talk about a marriage of those 2 things. What do we know from previous studies about attachment and where it comes from, and then again, how does that really work? So attachment refers most basically to a connection between a child and a caregiver. And I'm going to use the word caregiver today primarily to refer to mothers, fathers, biologically speaking, but I'm certainly also referring to foster parents and grandparents caring for their children, and all other kinds of configurations of child-caregiver relationships. If you look at what really makes up an attachment, there are 4 qualities that are considered characteristic of an attachment relationship. First off, as we've talked about, it needs to be an enduring relationship and an emotional relationship. So an emotional connection, being drawn to a specific person who brings you a sense of safety. And this should include a person that you're with that brings you some level of pleasure and helps you to self-regulate or to soothe when you're experiencing distress. Which really is at the crux of an attachment relationship, what distress and the way in which we're able to be soothed or helped by a caregiver when we're feeling distressed. So certainly if we perceive that we're going to lose somebody that we have an attachment relationship with, certainly as an infant, but then all the way up into adulthood, that we would feel distressed if we were going to lose that relationship. And it really is about safety. I think of attachment as our capacity to use other relationships, humans, to provide us with a sense of safety, and that begins with our very first primary caregiver relationship. So it's important for us to really understand that we are all fundamentally social folks, and all species have a biological drive to survive. Survival and protection, in fact, is one of the main organizers of our brain structure and function, ultimately. And as we all know, if you're a little tiny infant, the only way that you're actually going to survive is through a caregiver, a caregiving adult that has similar feelings of protection and closeness with you, that are willing to protect you and help you to survive. So what's also critical in this relationship is it isn't just the vulnerability and the desire and the biological predisposition for the infant to connect with the caregiver, but it's also the caregiver's ability to both understand that dependence, to be able to see that dependence, and be able to ultimately provide the kind of safety and mediation of distress and fear that the attachment relationship is supposed to bring to young infants. And just from the biological and instinctual basis, it's important to also remember that caregivers and infants have developed characteristics and different behavioral repertoires that help them to maintain the attachment relationship and to maximize survival. And one of the ways in which that happens is through neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are the substance that comes between our synaptic synapses and ultimately have an impact on our mood and our connected sense with other people. So in particular, when we have a sound attachment and when we have a caregiver that we're in contact with, or somebody else that we care about we're in contact with, and we feel good about it, then we get a release of positive neurotransmitters that both calm us and draw us to that person more specifically. And then in addition to neurotransmitters, there's also a really significant pattern of cues and signals, a dance, if you will, of serve and return that caregivers and infants engage in through this process. So if we think a little bit about the brain development occurring during this period of time, it's important for us all to remember that really during those first 3 years of life is when the structure and the architecture of the brain is being developed, and certainly the architecture and preparedness to be able to actually be connected and form attachments with people moving throughout your lifetime. And so this is certainly one of those functions, like many other of our sense development, hearing, sight, language, those kinds of things, that we can certainly say that attachment has a critical period, meaning that if they don't have experiences or opportunities during that 0 to 3 period, then a person's attachment capabilities or their capacity to maintain ongoing relationships can be potentially hindered throughout their lifetime. Again, we can talk later as we move through this webinar and others about brain plasticity and the ways in which we begin to change brains, but it certainly does become more challenging to change brain architecture when it's around relationships during that early period of time. So it's important also to think about what we're really talking about in terms of forming an attachment relationship is a set of behaviors, as we said before, cues that lead to an emotional connection between the caregiver and the child. So attachment develops through, as I'm sure you all are aware, through bonding behaviors and experiences. And I put the very first of those in capital letters because when we get down to it, what really is the most productive in developing attachment systems and in the release of human growth hormone is positive physical contact. So nurturing behaviors like holding and rocking and kissing and hugging and gazing those are the most powerful in terms of building a bonding behavior, given they are both, that they're cued appropriately and they're positive experiences for both the caregiver and the child. But also face-to-face interactions, and in particular face-to-face interactions in which eye contact is made, or there's some kind of sharing of sensory experiences, so shared smells and sounds and tastes have the same kind of power. But also in terms of face-to-face interactions, things like smiling and laughing and the rituals and games that we play with young children, like patty cake, for example, or peekaboo, those kinds of games. So I do want to recognize there can be sources of challenge and that there are lots of different factors that contribute to whether a sound attachment forms with a child or an infant and their caregiver. So if we look at the infant, we all know that kids come into the world with different temperaments, and while we can have a lot of change happen in genetic expression through epigenetics, through experiences that change the expression of our genes, we certainly come into the world with a certain personality or temperament makeup, and often that has to do with how easy you are to soothe when distressed, and how slow you are to warm up in terms of being able to relate to another person and the time with which it takes you to do that. But certainly other factors about an infant and a whole host of medical issues for an infant can also present challenges to attachment for the caregiver and for the infant. So they bring some things into the world that might make that easier or more challenging for particular caregivers. Then we can take a look at the caregiver and what are the kinds of things that obviously would produce a challenge to attachment. But what I would say as we move into all of this, what I convincingly know working with a lot of families and a lot of families that have experienced pretty profound maltreatment is that kids love their caregivers and they want to attach with their caregivers despite all kinds of circumstances. And I think that really speaks to the power of attachment and the biology of attachment. But certainly caregivers who approach their infant in an intrusive manner, so not necessarily sensitive or responsive to cues, not able to understand and pick up different emotional states and reflect that back to the child. But also things like being critical, overly critical of the child, and most of that being driven by a lack of understanding of typical developmental expectations for a child that age. And then obviously rejecting behaviors from a caregiver, and often those rejections, as we'll talk about as we move through our information, those rejections come from caregivers who have not had an opportunity to heal from their own attachment-related struggles, who may be triggered or reminded by their infant's distress of their own maltreatment or challenges with caregiver relationships. So not just intrusive or critical, but obviously maltreatment can cause young children to be more distant in relationships and less able to use the caregiver relationship or any others to feel safe and have an attachment relationship. Maternal mental illness and certainly substance abuse issues. I have people ask a lot these days to talk a bit about what's going to happen with the opiate crisis in terms of the attachment patterns of young children, and I certainly have many concerns about what this will mean to attachment patterns for kids that are having both those perhaps neglectful experience with a substance abusing parent, but also separations and removals from primary caregivers during that very critical period of attachment development. There are obviously then environments that also have can present a challenge to attachment, and it doesn't have to be maltreatment per se, but attachment forms, as I said a number of times already today, in the context of safety. And so if the caregiver and or the child are in an environment of domestic violence, for example, where fear is prevalent or ongoing, traumatic experiences or adverse experiences are occurring, then it can present a challenge to both the caregiver's ability to be protective and attuned to their child, but also the child's ability to use their caregiver in that capacity. And then last but not least, we've heard for many years about goodness of fit, that there's also needs to be a match between what the child brings in terms of temperament and who the caregiver is. So as we can imagine, a child who has a very robust and outgoing and rambunctious temperament with a caregiver who tends to be more withdrawn or quiet would be a bad match and would make the dance of serve and return and of attunement and understanding each other much more challenging. Okay, so we've been talking so far about attachment process, and we'll wrap back around to that, but I want to dig down a little bit about what supports the attachment relationship. And we already started to talk about bonding behaviors and cueing, and all of those fit within the umbrella of what we refer to as attunement. So it's really the building block of attachment. Attunement is interactive in nature. It's what we do to both read the cues, most often nonverbal cues in someone we're with, and then to share that or to use that to inform the relationship. And it also happens in great synchronicity. So while most of what we think about has a lag in time, our ability to be attuned with another person in a nonverbal manner happens pretty much simultaneously or at the exact same time as each other. Attunement really serves to make sure that people are getting their needs met in a relationship. So we cue, we signal distress, we look away, we frown, we do those kinds of things to provide a signal to the person we're attuned with or in a relationship with so that they can adjust their behavior and provide empathy or provide positive physical contact or provide feedback, whatever the information in that cue is being communicated. And I think the most important thing to think about, because we're going to talk later about how attunement can be interrupted when you're robbed of the opportunities through development to be with an attuned caregiver, but attunement can be taught. There's an abundance of research that shows that when we are specific and when we're aware and we provide ongoing coaching for caregivers, that they can learn quite effectively to be attuned with their child. What I would say is that often before the process of teaching someone how to be attuned with their child can happen, that caregiver first needs to have an opportunity to experience what it's like to be in an attuned relationship. And I think often that's what we're doing in helping relationships, be it home visitors or therapists or teachers or preschool providers, any of those folks, that much of what we're doing is hopefully providing attunement experiences and teaching how to be attuned to grow kiddos' brains. So Perry talks about the definition, Bruce Perry, of the definition of attunement is the process of paying attention to, reading each other's nonverbal cues, and responding appropriately given those cues. So one of the things I most like to talk about in terms of the interpersonal neurobiology is really how we're able to tune in to others. And that process is through what we've come to know as neurons. I have a little image there for you all. You can see the cute little monkeys. And just to give people an idea of where this came from, if it's new to you, this research was based on research done by Rizzolotti in Switzerland. And what they were trying to figure out with these little rhesus monkeys is where the location of their motor neurons were. And so they would wire the monkeys to EEG caps and have them engage in various behaviors, for example, peeling a banana. And then when the monkey engaged in that behavior, they indeed could see where the electrical current was located in the brain and positively identify that, yes, indeed, that's where motor neurons are located. But what also happened in that process is that there were multiple monkeys, I guess you would say, with EEG caps. And when a monkey was observing the banana peeling behavior, for example, in another monkey, what they found happen is that they had, at the exact same time, remember the synchronicity of it all, at the exact same time, a firing of motor neurons, which were mirror neurons, so mirror motor neurons. Pretty interesting. So what we learned from that is that when we are watching another person engage in a behavior and we're focused in an attuned kind of way, that we can actually imitate that behavior through the firing of our motor mirror neurons. What we've also learned is that we're able to really predict the intentions of others through mirror neurons. So, for example, if you think about the idea of somebody that has malintent, and for example, what they're thinking of doing is being angry with you or yelling at you, and what they do instead is have a smile on their face and say that everything is fine. What would happen is our emotional mirror neurons would resonate with the frustration of the person we're talking to, and we would begin to believe that the intent was not the positive intent that was being expressed verbally. So we can watch people's nonverbal cues, and we can get a sense of what we anticipate they plan to do next, and whether, basically speaking, that's a positive or negative intent. The larger process of kind of scanning and monitoring whether others are going to be safe with us, they refer to as neuroception, so that's scanning for intent. But most importantly to our conversation today about really understanding the science of relationships, mirror neurons also drive attunement, because mirror neurons allow us to be in the presence of somebody else. And if they're feeling a particular way, then literally our mirror neurons will resonate with the emotions of the person we're with, and we will begin to have those same feelings or emotions. So it happens on a variety of levels, and we'll talk a little bit later about different kinds of memories and how we can have different forms of memory, but certainly attunement and the resonating of somebody else's emotions is an emotional kind of memory and resonance. So by reading cues, nonverbal behaviors, our mirror neurons assist our brains in replicating the same firing of neurons. Attunement isn't simply our being able to pick up that process. As I started with, it really is an interactive process. So in order to be attuned with someone, we first have to be able to accurately get a read through our mirror neurons about what they're trying to convey or what they're experiencing in terms of emotion. That requires an intuition process, and part of the way we develop intuition is that we have experiences in our lives that tell us how particular circumstances make us feel. So part of it is our gut reactions or our memories of emotions and how that made us feel. When we're able to get a sense of what that might feel like for someone, and we also have to be able to express that, and express that in a way that conveys empathy. And empathy is really about understanding. So we're conveying that we understand the emotion that's being expressed, either verbally or, in this case, non-verbally, most likely. And then last but not least, once we convey that back, the ultimate process is really around regulation. So our job as caregivers, especially to young children, is to help our children learn to co-regulate. And the way we learn to regulate ultimately as an adult is through our ability to have co-regulating experiences with other caregivers, primary caregivers that help us to do that. So not only is attunement helping us to read the cues, it's very fundamental to our ability to feel safe in the world. And so if we go all the way back and think about Bowlby's work that really talked about our caregivers being a secure base, that we can look at them and they can convey to us we are safe as long as we're in their presence. But that ultimately we have to engage in proximity seeking, that we have to begin to explore our surroundings. Our job ultimately is to go out in the world, biologically speaking, and to procreate from an evolutionary perspective. And so once we are developmentally able to do so, we have to leave that secure base of our caregiver and to seek increasingly more novel circumstances, and then return to our caregiver to be that secure base. And when we are with the caregiver and they are accurately reading our cues and helping us to calm down, for example, if we've met a stranger or we entered a room that they weren't into, maybe, and then they see that that made us anxious and they give us a hug or they repeat that back or they give us the kind of smile or facial expression that helps us to calm down, then we feel safe. So ultimately, our sense of safety is derived largely interpersonally, and it is based on our caregiver's ability to accurately read our cues and then to help us feel safe. So if we go back to my example, if I'm a young child and I'm with my caregiver and what I'm feeling is scared and distressed, I don't necessarily have words for that. But if I'm in my caregiver's presence and the response of my caregiver to my level of distress is to smile or to look away or to label it as an emotion that isn't accurate, then we don't feel safe because there's an incongruence between how we feel emotionally, what our experience is, and what's reflected back to us from our caregivers. So I'd like to show you an example. Many people have seen the still face experiment, but I think it's probably the most poignant example of attunement processes. And what we're seeing here is a young child and an infant, and attunement processes are most powerful when we're 0 to 3 years of age in terms of how distressing it might be. So I'm going to go ahead and play the video, and then I'm going to pause for a moment to see if anybody has any questions. I'm just going to check in with Katie here. I think the volume is down on my computer so that we didn't have an echo. I apologize for that torturous sound, folks. Yeah, because I can't turn the volume on without the echo. We'll have to share those. Okay. Okay, thank you. All right, folks, I'm back. Technical difficulties around video. We'll share a link for folks to watch the still face video, given it would be a torturous echo sound for everybody during that process. But let me at least describe very briefly what we see here, and so we don't miss that step. So what we're about to observe is this mom and a young infant having synchronous interaction with each other, putting their hands up together and sharing. Mom is making eye contact with the baby and sharing facial expressions with the baby. And then in this research paradigm, the still face paradigm, the mom is asked to look away from the baby and then return to looking at the baby and to keep a neutral facial expression on her face. So nothing other than the facial expression that you're seeing on the screen right now, a neutral facial expression. What we watch proceed over about a 2-minute period of time is that the baby notices that mom is not cueing and noticing that her facial expressions are neutral. She begins to get more and more dysregulated and make various attempts to engage her mom, such as pointing so that maybe mom will follow the gaze, her gaze with the finger, and then also beginning to kind of squeak and squeal to see if that will draw mom's attention, and then eventually becoming really distressed and crying and turning away. What you'll notice if you get the opportunity to watch the video is the very powerful piece about that is once the mother is asked to turn away and return to gazing with her young child, almost instantaneously, the baby begins to soothe and the synchronicity of movements begin to share. And I would say within a 30-second period of time, the baby is completely re-regulated. And I think one of the important things to remember about this attunement process is what I mentioned before around distress. And that if we really get down to the crux of how we help young children feel safe in the world in the context of relationships, it's by being able to handle, manage, and recognize distress when that's what they're displaying. And we'll move into that a little bit later when we talk about how these patterns move forward. Okay, I'm going to pause for just a moment because we're moving into the next section. Are there any questions that folks have? You can feel free to enter those in as a chat on your computer if you'd like to. And I can certainly pause at any time if there are comments or questions that folks have about the material that's been shared thus far.
They can also unmute and ask a question if they'd like.
You can also unmute and ask a question if you would like. All righty then. I wish I could see everybody's faces. That makes it so much easier. So let's move into this next section. And what we really want to do is be able to explain how early childhood experiences with caregivers form a person's self-concept, their attachment style, and their worldview via what we call the internal working model. In order to understand how the internal working model develops, we need to review just a couple of brain basics to make sure that we're all on the same page. So bear with me here. What we'll all remember is in terms of the evolutionary development of the brain. When I say evolution, I mean how over eons of time our brain has developed to be the modern day humans we are today, but also how our brain develops from the time we're conceived throughout our lifetime. So most importantly for us to remember is that the brain has to develop in a sequence and a hierarchy. So as you can see from the image here, really simplistic brain image, but at the very base in terms of sequence, the start of it all in the hierarchy is our brain stem. And our brain stem is responsible for everything that keeps us alive. So breathing, heart rate, satiety, or our hunger and thirst, and then our sleep-wake consciousness cycle. So it makes sense that that would have to develop first to make us viable as a human. The next part of our brain in the sequence and hierarchy to develop, getting more complex from the more primitive, would be the midbrain or our limbic system, and that's what houses the emotion center of our brain, and primarily the amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain. There's also lots of connections with memory that we'll talk about as we move into memory discussion a little bit later. And then last but not least, once the brainstem and the limbic system have developed, then and only then can our cortex, our ability to have a higher order thinking, and in particular, the prefrontal cortex, the front part of our brain that we often refer to as executive functioning, develops. That is our ability to learn from consequences, plan for the future, engage in nuanced social relationships, inhibit our behavior, understand our emotions. We could go on and on and on. suffice to say that in order to be a fully functioning person in the world, we are reliant upon the development of our prefrontal cortex. And if there are experiences or lack of experiences that allow us to develop those first parts of our brain, then that will compromise the later development of the prefrontal cortex. And if we kind of look behind that process, just remember what we're talking about here is a group of neurons or nerve cells that are located in the brain. And those have a cell body, and they have axons that are myelinated or have a coating on them that is connected to other neurons. We're not necessarily interested in terms of full brain development just in those particular brain structures that develop. But as we all know now, it's much more about the ways in which our brain is connected, or the way in which we have a web of neural networks or associations. So how is the bottom of our brain connected to the top of our brain, and the left side to the right side, et cetera. So really, what happens is we have a firing of a neuron, that's an electrical current. It results in a change in chemical and structure, so that if we have a neuron that fires in unison with another neuron, then that makes it more likely that that particular pairing of neurons is going to happen again. And the more times that that happens, the more likely that particular neuronal pathway is to happen again. That's what we call memory and learning, really, is how ingrained those systems come. So in the neurobiology literature, you see the phrase neurons that fire together, wire together, referring to just what we're talking about right now, that once you have those two fire together, that it increases the likelihood that it can happen again. So I started to talk earlier today. It just took me a while for my mind to really wrap around this idea, but we have lots of different kinds of memories. Typically, when we think about memory in our world, we think about cognitive memories, language-based memories that are driven by our hippocampus, so memories that we're able to recall when we would like to do so or upon some kind of practice. But we also have other kinds of memory. We have memories that are just motor memories, meaning they don't have any connection with our prefrontal cortex. It really is memory located within the motor regions of our brain, often the cerebellum and the sensory motor portions of our brain. But then we can also have emotional memories, memories for affect, with the intent of keeping us safe. So we can have a particular feeling about something, but not necessarily have a thought connected to that either. If we, for example, have a reaction or a feeling to a particular person or a circumstance, and we take time thinking or reflecting about that reaction, it may be that because we've spent that time connecting a thought to that feeling, that later on we may have that neuron fire together and recognize that emotional reaction quite quickly. Much of what we're doing in psychotherapy as we begin to change the brain. We also want to remember that information is stored in the brain in a use-dependent fashion. So we've all heard that if you are exhausted and you're studying for a test, the best way in terms of state-dependent memory to recall it is if you're also exhausted. But it also can be use-dependent. So the more the system is activated, the more that system is built in. And when we turn our attention to trauma and adverse childhood experiences, that's when that really comes into play, these built-in fear systems that begin to drive behavior. And we've talked before that neuronal systems also have critical periods, and that we do have brain plasticity, meaning we can both grow new neurons and change the function and structure of our brain throughout our lifetime. But as Bruce Perry says, experiences during the critical periods of early childhood, 0 to 3, organize the brain systems. So we need to also bring our discussion of memory into this process to understand internal working models. Remember that memory has both internal and external inputs. Often we think about everything we remember is what we see, what comes into our senses. But as we were just talking about the different forms of memory, we also have internal memories for mood and motor things such as that. We remember through a number of different processes. We typically rely pretty heavily in our society on repetition or rote memory. But we can also remember things through what they call emotional tagging, meaning I feel scared about something, I feel sad about something, and that emotion memory is very powerful because it's reminding us not to return to that particular circumstance again in the future. And just like we've been talking about other neural networks, really what memory is the pattern of neuronal firing that is recalled when we are prompted or provoked by a particular circumstance. And it causes our previous experiences in the forms of memories to produce expectations for what we think are going to happen in certain circumstances. All of us have both implicit and explicit memory. Implicit memory are the memories that we have between 0 and 3. Often we refer to that period as infantile amnesia. It isn't that we don't remember, we don't lay down explicit memories until approximately the age 3. We do lie down, however, implicit memories, emotion and sensory motor memories. So their implicit memories are unconscious, traumatic, early life experience memories that don't have language with them. They are involved with the amygdala and are responsible for helping us seek out things that are familiar and those that are safe. Most fear-based memories, as you see there, are implicit memories. We also have explicit memories, which are regulated by the hippocampus and modulated by arousal, meaning if we're too stressed or we're too anxious or we're too fearful, then our hippocampus does not lay down explicit memories and we switch gears, and instead we lie down very strong implicit memories of those experiences without explicit memory. And without spending a lot of time on it, it's important for all of us to understand that even our day-to-day behavior, meaning everything we do during the course of the day, how we relate to other people, our reactions, all of those things are largely driven by implicit memory. So most of our behavior, 95 to 99% of our behavior on a daily basis is driven by implicit behavior. And given we're talking about attachment and attunement right now, especially our interactions with other people, our interpersonal relationships are largely driven by implicit memory. So implicit memory, as I began to allude to, is that we begin to actually form implicit memories about 8 months in utero. They do include a preference for experiences involving the mother, preference for mother's voice or smell, etc. Our brain remembers experiences and how they made us feel before we even have that prefrontal cortex develop, and before we even have an ability to have abstract language or thought. It happens largely outside of our awareness, as I mentioned before. 95 to 99% of it is operating in our lives. It manifests through our attitudes, our beliefs, and our behaviors. And Louis Kozolina would say that each form of memory has its own neural architecture and developmental timetable. Each of those kinds of motor emotions, etc., develop on its own timetable and have its own structures in place as well. Implicit memories show up in our beliefs, preferences, and automatic ways of relating to other people, and especially our ways of relating to our young children. So when we're young and we have these cueing behaviors, the serve and return opportunities, what happens is we have repeated interactions with caregivers that begin to teach the child about the world, especially about safety and fear. And we really develop all of our beliefs about who we are and whether we are worthy of love and belonging in the context of our relationship with our caregiver, but it also tells us about what we believe about other people and whether they're trustworthy, and what we believe about the world at large, and whether ultimately it will be a safe place. So, as Kozolina would say, we have these summations of thousands of experiences with our caretakers to become the unconscious, reflexive predictions of the behaviors of others. And we call these internal working models, or schemas, or attachment schemas. They're a form of implicit memory that drive our interpersonal relationship. Internal working models have elements that are emotional and motivational, but also cognitive. They have an impact on our physiological functioning and especially our capacity to regulate our emotions when stressed and to engage in interpersonal relationships. And they affect our ability to engage in reflective functioning or mentalization or theory of mind, TOM as it's often called. So internal working models also affect our ability to reflect upon who we are and how we parent, frankly. So relationships and self-regulation, as I've talked about today, are very intertwined. The social brain and fear circuitry say this, share the amygdala as the core structure. So the early negotiation of relationships and the modulation of fear become the one and the same. So if we have disruptions in the attachment relationship, then they will impact the development of self-regulation abilities, especially self-regulation in interpersonally distressing times. And these patterns of regulating become enduring long-term patterns of arousal, reactions to stress, and interpersonal behaviors. This slide is a summary slide. So what we've been walking through so far today is to look at how attunement processes through serve and return interactions form the foundation of an attachment relationship, which allows a child to begin to explore the world and to feel safe when doing so. And then these repeated interactions become our biology through internal working models, which tell us who we are as a person, what to expect in relationships, and what kind of worldview we should possess. For a long time, we've talked about learned helplessness as primarily a cognitive function. But given what we know at this point about interpersonal neurobiology, we're much more aware that our attachment patterns and styles actually contribute significantly to our ability to hold hope. So when we consider something like trait hope, the likelihood as a personality that we choose to be hopeful, really attunement and attachment are the foundation for even that form of hope. Martin Seligman is the one who spoke with us or taught us a lot about learned helplessness. And what we know about learned helplessness partly comes from the paradigm, a little hard to see on the slide today, but the paradigm in which we tortured poor dogs. We put them in a device in which they had two sections with a hurdle in the middle or a solid wall. They'd ring a bell and produce a shock on the floor. Half the doggies could jump from the shocking floor and escape into the non-shocking floor. The other half were unable to do so. After they'd spent several trials of either the escape or non-escape condition, they put all of the dogs in the escape condition. Those dogs that were not able to escape, despite the fact that they were aware that they could escape, did not attempt to do so because of learned helplessness. So it's a very powerful process that we actually know now operates on a biological level and is connected to our internal working model and attachment relationship. It can create passivity. We know it to be connected with depressive symptoms. It leaves us vulnerable to all kinds of medical problems and leads us to have negative expectations in relationships. This is a video. We will share a link of that video as well. Okay, so moving into our last piece of the shortest rendition of interpersonal neurobiology ever done. We want to describe how a person's relationship history then impacts their interpersonal functioning, including the caregiver relationship. And we'll talk more about that in other webinars as well. So the first thing I want to remind us is that that we tend to engage in reenactment. And reenactment really is the habit of recreating old relationships with new people. So people will joke that often folks marry their mother or their father. And the reality of that is, even though we may say we're not going to either end up being like them or end up with people in relationships, we like familiarity and we tend to be drawn to relationships that feel familiar. And it's also consistent with our beliefs about ourselves, how we view ourselves. So reenactment is one of the processes by which our internal working model and our familiarity in attachment and attachment patterns lead us to engage in relationships in a particular way throughout our lifetime. When we think about mirror neurons, there are two terms that come to mind. Number one is emotion contagion, and motion contagion refers to that ability of us to feel the emotions of another person. And what that means is that if we are able to feel the emotions of another person, that both we could be impacted by negative emotions of that other person, but we can also impact positively the emotions of another person. So the other word that folks talk about is parallel process, the idea that those relationships carry forward, and often that relationship challenges that we have with people aren't really about us per se, but are about that reenactment or parallel process of other relationships feeling out. So now parallel process is really about the feelings then from a relationship that are not the current experience. And here's that driving negative cognitive triad then that would operate automatically. Negative, I'm starting on the bottom left here, negative views about myself, I am worthless, negative views about the world, everybody hates me because I'm worthless, and negative views about the future. It's another way to look at that, which is I'll never be good at anything because everybody hates me and I'm ultimately worthless. If we have a sound attachment, that tends to lead us into sound relationship experiences. If we have subpar attachment experiences or some kind of failure in the attachment system, that not only does it result in the development of the negative cognitive triad we've been talking about, but it also causes problems with relationships, and particularly around a sense of vulnerability and a fear of abandonment. So we find that we are unable to co-regulate in the context of relationships. You do not have the capacity to empathize, beginning with unable to use attunement to co-regulate, and then unable to understand the experiences, because part of that is not understanding your own experiences. It can look like the aggressive stance, being proactively assertive or aggressive toward other people in order to hide your level of vulnerability. And it can also lead you into relationships that cause further victimization. So ultimately, really, our self-concept and self-regulation capacities end up being compromised. I'm going to go through a couple of slides here because I want to make sure that we have a couple of minutes in case there are any questions. So now's your chance to type if you have those. So a caregiver's ability to provide this early sense of attunement and safety for children to observe and mirror is reliant upon their own brain development. So now if we look at how these early attachment relationships might impact our caregiving capacity, well, when we're a caregiver and we didn't receive those kinds of loving, nurturing, bonding experiences, then we don't have the positive neurotransmitter release or the activation of the pleasure reward system in the context of interpersonal relationships. We don't have the level of mirror neuron system development so that those caregivers can attune to the same degree that we would want them to deal with it. And so ultimately, their interactions with their child are less pleasurable, and their ability to mirror, empathize, and co-regulate with their child becomes compromised. So we're really beginning to invite people to think about the way in which they were parented and whether they would do that the same or differently. And having an understanding that your behavior toward your child also can be traced back to at least some degree to how you were personally raised. Dan Siegel talks about the gold is in the shadows, and what that means is, unfortunately, those things that are most challenging, most distressing, most upsetting, most distasteful for us are those that we have the most challenge looking at. And we can follow up on a future webinar about that topic in particular. I'm going to show one last slide and then some information. So the process by which personality or the intergenerational transmission of trauma is that we have early childhood experiences that we either cope with successfully or we have an inability to cope with. They become implicit memories that give us strong reactions and traumatic expectations and relationships. And then that becomes the way in which we interact with people, part of our personality development. All right, and that leaves us about 3 minutes left. Certainly if there's any questions, you can unmute yourself or enter a question into the chat. I have also my email address up there on my website. I have lots of resources there, and if you have additional questions you didn't come up with today, you're more than welcome to send me an email, and I'd be happy to respond. I want to thank all of you very much for listening to me talk today. It's much more challenging when I don't get to see you face to face, but I really look forward to the opportunity to talk about what this means for the work you all do.
Thank you again, everybody, for being on the webinar today. I apologize for the video issues. We will include the links to those YouTube videos in the follow-up email. I have chatted the evaluation survey into the group chat, so please take a moment to complete that survey or share the survey if you're doing this in a room with a group of people. And I just also want to remind you that this is the first of a 3-part webinar series that Dr. Yackley will be presenting for us. The next one is on April 20th from 9:30 to 10:30, and the title of that webinar is Putting the Science of Relationships to Practice, Promoting Healthy Attachment. So again, thank you everybody for being on the webinar today, and we will follow up with the links as well as the link to the webinar recording posted online. Have a wonderful day.